From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And coming up today, K-State's Romulo Lollato on the option of planting a spring wheat variety on acreage that wasn't seeded to winter wheat as intended last fall because of the wet field conditions. He'll talk about what K-State research has shown about the viability of this alternative. Also, highlights from the latest Cattle Chat podcast out of the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State. This time, Brad White, Bob Larson, Bob Weaber, Dustin Pendell, and special guest Chuck Dodd. We'll give an overview of the current demand for large animal veterinarians in rural areas. Further ahead this week's K-State Horticulture segment, Cheryl Boyer will look at the emerging opportunities for marketing and purchasing horticultural plant materials online. Here on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
You're tuned to Agriculture Today. Glad to have you aboard once again. We're going to talk wheat production in Kansas once more from a different vantage point, and that is there merit in planting spring wheat, considering that a lot of acres didn't get in this past fall because of adverse weather conditions? Back by once again, Romulo Lollato, wheat production specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Before we get into all of that, though, Romulo, just a very, very quick thought about the polar vortex that has rolled in this week. It's now warming up in Kansas, thankfully, but ultra-cold temperatures, and have they had adverse impacts on the wheat crop?
So, Eric, that's a very good question, and I think the crop that I would be concerned the most is the very small wheat that got planted late. Right, so right now the state of Kansas has pretty much 2 crops. One that got planted before October 5th. It's about 55 or 60% of the state, which actually looks really good. And for the most part, for that crop, we would not expect any damage or any winter kill unless we had temperatures at the crown level that got single digits or close to zero. Although air temperatures got to that zero or even below zero temperatures, I think that early planted crop should be okay. Now, the crop that was planted late, that doesn't have 2, 3, 4, 5 tillers yet, that only has perhaps the main plant or maybe 1 tiller, that crop is going to be more exposed, right? So if we did not, in circumstances like a no-till after soybeans, perhaps if we did not get a very good seed-soil contact, if those furrows were still a little bit open, perhaps we can see some winter kill in that situation. So I think my concern there would be a small crop that was planted late, because the crop naturally wouldn't have as much winter hardiness than a bigger crop. Or in situations where those furrows are still relatively open and exposed in the crown, or heavy no-till where we have quite a bit of residue as well. So I think there is the potential for some spots here and there, but that's where I would expect damage, if any damage at all.
That's the point here, if any damage. This story will be told over the coming days and weeks. In fact, you'll be putting together further thoughts in an e-update article at week's end here to capture more information about what's going on, right?
Definitely, yes.
So be watching for that, by the way, at agronomy.ksu.edu. Now to this idea of sowing wheat in Kansas in the spring. Something that's very atypical, of course, for Kansas. Why we're discussing it and considering it for the spring gets back to the fact there may be some open acreage yet out there that was not planted to wheat, was intended to be so, but weather did not allow. So is this a viable candidate is what we're about here.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why some producers have been asking about spring wheat. It's like, okay, well, should those acres that we were intending to plant to spring wheat, but we never planted them because of too much moisture in October and November should then go to spring wheat. So that would be one of the reasons that producers are asking. The other reason is some niche market as well, kind of developing for protein premiums, in which producers contract with different companies beforehand. And so these will be those type of IP contracts where the producer will make this contract to deliver a spring wheat beforehand. So the company perhaps doesn't need to bring it from North Dakota, right? So that will be the two main reasons why. Now the question that I pose here, and this actually is a question that is coming from some discussions with a colleague out of Australia where they're planting winter and spring wheats. Are these spring wheats really higher in protein, or is it simply because we are talking about different regions with different management practices? In other words, are the folks in the traditional spring wheat region simply fertilizing more than us here in Kansas? And that might be the case because in many of those states, they will get penalized if they have a given protein less than a certain amount. Whereas in Kansas, we typically don't see that. So the average fertilization might be on 90 or 100 units of nitrogen per acre, whereas in Kansas, it might be more on the 50 or 60. So there is a chance that maybe there's not only a genetic difference in protein accumulation, but it's mostly an issue of fertilization. Perhaps states up north fertilizing more than what we are doing here. Now, some of that question is actually coming from these discussions because apparently that's not the case in Australia. In Australia, both winter and spring wheats, they have about the same level of protein. And this is a question that we are wanting to answer here for Kansas as well. So in a project that we might start here next year with the Wheat Commission is comparing different winter wheat varieties with different spring wheat varieties and seeing if they're truly naturally accumulating more protein or it's just a matter of more fertilization up north or not.
You mentioned the protein factor, but what's on producers' minds as well, equally so, yield potential. What do we know about spring wheat variety yield output here in Kansas?
So K-State has done some research with that in the past, and in my own project, I have done some research with that as well. And overall, I mean, year in, year out, the average is about half. So if we're planting a spring wheat variety in the spring, typically it's going to yield half of what a winter wheat variety planted in the fall will. And that, of course, will depend on the conditions during the spring. So if we have a very warm spring and dry spring, it might be the yield penalty might be even more. Now, if we have a very cool and nice and long, cool, moist spring, maybe the yield penalty is going to be less than that. So, but on average, year in, year out is about 50%. And just to give an example, the spring of 2016 might still be on our producers' mind because that was a record-breaking crop. That's when we did some of our trials with spring wheat. And even under those almost perfect conditions for the winter wheat crop, the spring wheat crop was still pretty late. So we planted it sometime in February, in Garden City and in Ashland Bottoms, so two very distinct regions in the state.
Ashland Bottoms here near Manhattan.
Exactly, yep. By the time the spring wheat varieties were flowering, the winter wheat varieties were towards the end of grain filling already. So just that difference in flowering time, those spring wheat varieties flowering much later than the winter wheat varieties, it already brings their yield potential down because the grain filling is going to happen during heat stress. So I think if producers are growing spring wheat simply for the protein premium, they need to have a very good premium to compensate for the winter crop.
This prompts the question, though, can one plant a winter wheat variety in the spring instead? Would that be more advantageous?
And that's another thing that we also tested in the spring of 2016. So we were planting winter wheat varieties in the fall, winter wheat varieties in the spring, and spring wheat varieties in the spring. Those three scenarios there. And by far the highest yielding was the fall planted winter wheat. That season we were averaging 65 to 75 bushels per acre. Spring wheat varieties ranged between 25 and 35, so they were about half. And the winter wheat varieties, some of the winter wheat varieties, especially those with a short vernalization requirement, they did really well. And I have in my mind the clear example of Everest, that is a wheat variety with a relatively short vernalization requirement here. it did as well as the spring wheat. And we had a few other winter varieties that did just as well as the spring wheat. I believe last year, Oklahoma State had a trial where they were delaying planting dates and testing different winter wheat varieties, and seems like Zenda did pretty well as well. So it's another variety with Everest in the background. So if you are in the central part of the state and you're considering planting winter wheat during the spring, I would consider those. Either Everest or Zenda, they have shown to do very well for being planted in the spring, but still have in mind that it will likely yield about half of what your winter wheat planted in the fall would have.
And on top of that, any spring planted wheat will come with challenges, you stress.
Sure. So I think these challenges start just at planting, right? So I'm pretty sure that if conditions continue as they have been, the soil will either be frozen or too wet. And so when are we going to be able to get in our fields to plant? That would be a huge challenge, right? Because if it's not frozen, it's going to be too wet to get into the fields. And that creates the first really mechanical challenge. We might not be able to get it planted in good time. And if it gets to March or so, producers would be actually encouraged to look at a summer crop rather than any winter wheat or even spring wheat, in my opinion, especially if they have moisture in the profile. But as the topic is spring or winter wheat planted in the spring now, that would definitely be a challenge because we need to plant either one as soon as possible. Anytime from here on, February on, either a spring or a winter wheat crop can be planted. But the challenge will be too much mud. And then the other challenge, of course, it comes later in the season with this delayed cycle. Grain filling will happen sometime in July, and those will be extremely hot conditions that will decrease our yield potential. So I think it's a fun topic for us to talk about and make some considerations. But I think that producers who have a good moisture in their profile and thinking about their profitability will probably be better off with either corn or a soybean crop at this time.
Those are the realities of planting a spring wheat variety in the spring or even a winter wheat variety in the spring. Romulo, we appreciate the word, and undoubtedly we'll be talking with you about the condition of the winter wheat crop as things become more clear on that. Hopefully no winter kill has ensued, but time will tell very soon. Thank you for coming over, as always.
Thank you, Eric.
He is Romulo Lollato, a wheat production specialist with K-State Research and Extension, and we'll be back with more. This is Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
You are listening to Agriculture Today, and up for you now, highlights from the latest Cattle Chat podcast out of the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State. The theme this time, replenishing the livestock veterinarian corps in rural areas, and as part of that, what communities can do to encourage tomorrow's practitioners. At the table this week, the full crew, K-State veterinarians Brad White and Bob Larson, cow-calf specialist Bob Weaber, livestock economist Dustin Pendell, and a special guest, as introduced by Brad.
We're happy to have Dr. Chuck Dodd, who's the Director of Outreach here at the Kansas State College of Veterinary Medicine. And we're going to spend a fair bit of time today talking about veterinarians, rural practice, talking about vet school, also talk a little bit about the demand for veterinarians and interacting with your veterinarians. One of the things that, Chuck, you do a lot, spend a lot of time doing, and is the outreach. And you've had a pretty diverse career that's given you that background to be able to work with veterinarians, practitioners, people in the field. And a lot of your job now is interacting with veterinarians. I know you get a lot of questions, interaction with those veterinarians. What are some of the issues you see? What are some of the things that come up that would help you interact with veterinarians in the field?
Sure, Brad. As I perform an outreach role for the college, which is fairly new, and we're still trying to figure out exactly how that's best defined, because inherently a lot of the things we do here at the university are outreach. We engage our communities. But what we find basically is we talk to the people, I could call them stakeholders, but I think primarily my focus is with our graduates, our veterinarians that are practicing in the area. And I try to make it a point to stop in and see them at their clinics and try to learn more about what some of the struggles are that they have and what things are going well. And I think we see common themes throughout our area with our graduates.
What are some of the things, and you mentioned some of the things that are challenges or maybe even on the opportunity side. Mm-hmm. What are some of the things that you're seeing in the field, some of the questions that you get from those veterinarians?
Especially in Kansas, we have a lot of areas where veterinarians are looking for more veterinarians in order to expand their practices. And it's sometimes difficult to do, especially in rural areas. And I know that's been discussed before, but I think what we find is that there's not an easy answer to that. And so we hear that quite a bit from our graduates.
Well, and, so as a veterinary college, one of our inputs is students. And honestly, in rural communities, because agricultural operations are getting larger, there's fewer students per county that are really available to go back to those counties. So there's still a lot of demand for veterinary services and for young veterinarians to go back in that community, but there's not as many young high school seniors coming out of those communities to go back. And that's something we're not going to change. That's just a challenge that I think we're facing, and we talk about the next generation of veterinarians.
Dustin, I know you've worked a fair bit, and you've worked with the American Veterinary Medical Association, have talked with them on some of the data as they look at nationwide demand and how it's been evolving over time. You want to tell us a little bit about where we are on demand?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, the AVMA, Matt Saloy, who's the director of the economics division, and his staff put together some various slides looking at supply-demand issues related to veterinarians, and some of the stuff that we talked about, I guess it was last week at the conference, was just looking at different indicators for demand and supply. And in short, there's a lot of jobs available right now for DVMs, and there's just the supply is lacking, or there's less of a supply. Now, there's a lot of other factors, whether it's the type of practice. They also had a map of all the jobs, the supply where people were at versus where all the jobs were. A lot of those jobs weren't necessarily in rural areas.
A lot of urban areas on the coast, and then in the cities.
Yep,
in the
exactly. So I think there's a lot of factors that play into the supply-demand issues, but all the different indicators that they had presented were the demand was there.
And as you're thinking about talking to either a student that's in high school that might be interested in going to veterinary school or a young veterinarian, that's good news. I mean, it's good to have good demand versus bad demand. It would be quite discouraging to think this is the job you wanted and there's not much demand for it.
Absolutely, and specifically the demand right now is pretty robust. But they've also said, the last 3 years it's been like this.
Chuck, does that coincide with what you're seeing in the field?
Indeed. As I talk to our practitioners out and about, what I find is that several veterinarians practice owners have been trying to hire veterinarians, sometimes 3, 4, 5 years unsuccessfully. Also, we find occasionally they may hire a new graduate who comes in for about a year and then kind of uses that practice as a stepping stone, which is great for their career progression. But sometimes it's hard to get a veterinarian to go into a rural area and become engaged in that community and part of the community and eventually buy in, not just to the practice, but also the community. Community
engagement, right? Getting involved in the community, being a part of the community, not just at the practice.
Indeed. It's exciting when we have candidates that apply for veterinary school that discuss how they want to serve their community, how they want to serve society, and I think that's exciting.
Well, I was just going to say that as a young person, a lot of times it's very easy to get focused on the quick and the short-term goals about, getting my feet on the ground, so that's both financially, family, a lot of things. But if you're really going to kind of set down roots, that's beyond yourself and your immediate family. Your roots really have to do with your whole community. And so then, again, that's both encouraging the students to see the world that way, but also see the communities kind of challenge the communities to, if you want this young new veterinarian to stay, really get them as involved in the community as you can.
So I think those are excellent points. And so the demand is there. We have good students coming into veterinary school, but as you interact with your veterinarian and people in the community, and even like we talked about ag teachers, some of those with those prospective students, they're watching, they see that example, and they see the potential for a profession that's going to either spark them down that career path or not. So I think all of us set an example as we go through that.
Well, I think, I can look at myself, and the three big influences for me were my family, but also my VOAG teacher and the 4-H experience that I had. Those were all very instrumental in, first of all, my interest in livestock, and then the next thing that I became interested in was veterinary medicine. And really, all three of those had a huge influence on my decisions, and I think that would be true for a lot of our young veterinarians as well, since I'm not in that young category anymore.
Those little things matter. So our BCI Cattle Chat checklist today is we wanted to give the top 5 things. If you were talking to a student prior to coming to veterinary school, what are the top 5 tips that you would give them? Bob, you want to start?
You betcha. I think it's really important that they like people, not just animals. I mean, there's a rare person that doesn't really like, if they've been around livestock, you like livestock. If you've been around pets, you like pets. There's a rare person that doesn't like being around animals. But it's really about, and Chuck was saying about your community. Do you want to come in and help make your community better? Now, you're going to do that through your livestock health job, but do you really want to help your community?
All the animals that you see have people attached to them.
They do, and the people have the checkbook.
Yes. Chuck?
Well, I think it's important. Students will never make it to the interview for veterinary school if they don't have the right grades. And so, indeed, their grades need to be high enough throughout high school and undergraduate studies, as well as on a standardized test such as the GRE. But I think that's something we need to keep in mind as communities. We need to encourage our youngsters to work hard in that way, because sometimes what we find, especially from rural communities, a lot of our students, they work hard. They have chores. They have other jobs that they're working at. And it's not always as easy to have the highest grades. And so I think it's important for us to encourage them to not overlook that aspect and make sure that they still work hard at other things, but at the same time they also keep the grades up high enough.
I'd say number 3 is probably hands-on animal experience. So it's one thing to say you love livestock or animals, but actually being able to demonstrate that you've got experience in that area seems like a great, particularly going into large animal experience. I think that lends a lot of credibility as those practitioners go out into practice, that they've got that confidence when they show up on the farm or ranch, and there's one way to get that, and it's go do it.
Number 2, a lot of times with my undergrad students, I preach to just getting life experiences, extracurriculars, join a club. Don't just join a club, but be active in a club, become a president, and those kinds of things, whether it's a job or different leadership activities, but to get these life experiences.
So you got to be well rounded, and the number one thing we came up with was spend time working in veterinary practices, and it's plural, so not just a single practice, but because they're all a little bit different. So get out and spend some time working in veterinary practices. You see what it's actually like on a day-to-day basis, and that helps. So our top 5 tips for preparing for veterinary school: you got to like people, not just animals. Keep up the grades, hands-on animal experience. Do some of those extracurricular activities. Don't just do the grades, and get out and see some vet practices. So those are our top 5 tips for our BCI Cattle Chat checklist. We appreciate you joining us for this episode. If you have any questions or comments or want to send us a topic to talk about next time, please email us at bci@ksu.edu.
K-State's Brad White, Bob Larson, Bob Weaber, Dustin Pendell, and Chuck Dodd. Hear the entire podcast at beefcattleinstitute.org, beefcattleinstitute.org, and you're tuned to Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
This is the K-State Radio Network, and you're listening to Agriculture Today, our Thursday edition. Eric Atkinson here. Now, today's agricultural news headlines for you, courtesy in part of DTN. USDA agencies have started to detail how they're going to handle those reports that were missed or delayed or canceled during the partial government shutdown. Starting with export data, the Foreign Agricultural Service has not published a weekly export sales report since December the 20th. The FAS has resumed daily reporting of export sales and will be implementing a schedule to bring weekly reporting up to date. The regular reporting schedule will resume for the week ending February the 22nd. The USDA's Gary Crawford has more on this.
That partial government shutdown resulted in almost a complete halt in USDA commodity reports and forecasts.
And so trade to me has been very cautious and very limited because there's not been a lot to trade on.
USDA's Outlook Board Chairman Seth Meyer, for example, two reports that traders look for are the daily and weekly export sales numbers, which were not published during the shutdown. Meyer said we had data on what commodities were inspected, sold, and shipped already.
But we don't know what's been sold and still on the books, because that hasn't been reported. That information now has to be compiled and reported.
Here's how the USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service plans to do that. It's resumed daily reporting now, but expects the report for the week ending December 20th to come out Thursday this week, and the week ending December 27th coming Thursday next week, and so on until February 22nd when they publish a combined report for the 6 weeks ending between January 10th through February 14th. Then they'll be caught up and start reporting on a regular basis. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
Now, the National Agricultural Statistics Service has also started rescheduling reports that were affected by the shutdown. NASS was not able to collect data nor issue reports due to the lack of funding. The following reports have been rescheduled. Others will be announced as soon as they are determined. Several major reports initially scheduled for January the 11th will be coming out in the February 8th reports, including the crop production report. Estimates will be included in crop production to be released on the 8th. Grain stocks to be released on the 8th, as will the winter wheat and canola seedings report. The next cattle on feed report, which will be basically skipped for January, it'll be released February the 22nd, and that USDA cattle inventory report, which was to be released today, will be released February the 28th. Also, the 2017 Census of Agriculture will be delayed. A new date for that has not yet been determined. The U.S. could send 300 million gallons of ethanol to China here in 2019 if the trade war between the two countries were to be resolved. That's according to the chief economist at the U.S. Grains Council, Mike Dwyer, as he spoke to the Iowa Renewable Fuels Summit this week. Dwyer said exports to China could reach 1 billion gallons in 2020 as that country expands its ethanol use. A group of U.S. agricultural interests, including the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association and others while in China, met with U.S. Ambassador to China Terry Branstad back in September. China is one market that makes agricultural interests salivate, in Dwyer's words. In talks this week, U.S. officials are expected to urge China to drop its anti-dumping and countervailing duties on distillers' dried grains. And changes required to U.S. law in implementing legislation for the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, including several provisions concerning agriculture, were detailed this week to U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer. He provided the information in a letter to Senate Finance Committee Chairman Chuck Grassley. The USTR is required to provide a list of legal changes associated with new trade agreements within 60 days of their signing. USTR noted several legal adjustments needed for changes associated with agriculture. In exchange for greater market access for U.S. dairy, poultry, and eggs in Canada, the U.S. agreed to give additional market access to Canadian goods. It agreed to eliminate tariffs and create new tariff rate quotas for certain Canadian agricultural products, those including dairy, sugar, peanuts, and cotton. To implement those changes, Congress must pass legislation authorizing the new tariff treatment and the quotas. Another change has to do with the application of special agricultural safeguards safeguards provided under the World Trade Organization's Uruguay Round Agreement on Agriculture. Under those provisions, WTO members may impose additional tariffs on ag products when imports exceed certain levels, but unlike traditional safeguards, countries do not have to demonstrate that the imports are harming or threatening to harm their domestic industry. Coming your way now on Agriculture Today, this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update. Standing by with that, as always, is Greg Akagi. Greg?
Paul Burke, who serves as Senior Director of U.S. Soy Marketing with the U.S. Soybean Export Council, joins us. And Paul, so much focus, and your focus too, has been on China.
Well, what we haven't seen is exports moving at the volumes that we're traditionally used to. Normally, at this time of the year, we'd be used to see, China was basically like a huge shop vac sucking soybeans out of the Gulf and out of the PNW, and that's obviously gone. But we are seeing soybeans in all other markets going at a fairly a good pace. We feel very confident that we're going to be filling up a lot of export demand that would traditionally went to Brazil. Those countries in Europe and North Asia and Southeast Asia will have to buy U.S. soy. We think at the end of the year, we're going to look back and say, okay, our exports are at the level that they were a year before, but it's just going to be a lot slower process. And if you're in the upper Midwest at where the pipeline traditionally started, you're seeing a lot of backups, and that's a problem.
In the short term or long term, how do you look at this playing out?
The U.S. soybean industry, we understand the crisis that's taking place out on the farm. And I want all farmers to know that we understand that, and we are working double time in the first year to move the export supply we have. We're going into markets where we've long had a presence, but really promoting the U.S. soy advantage. We're going to be bringing teams to the PNW, promoting the PNW as an export channel for customers that didn't traditionally buy out of the PNW. But in the long term, so moving into the next several years, we're going to be having to develop demand in markets with high populations but low soy per capita consumption. Particularly, we're talking about places like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, and that's really where a lot of our future investments are going to be going, to show those people how to consume more soy, grow more chickens, grow more fish, and then ultimately have to import more U.S. soy. In all those economies that I mentioned, as people's incomes go up, they're going to want to continue to increase their animal protein consumption. Some markets like India, they're not a pork consumer, but there's a lot of opportunities to expand egg production and expand poultry production as well as fish production. And when that economy grows, they consume their soy, and we get market access, we'll see U.S. soy exports explode into that region.
Paul Burke is joining us, Senior Director of U.S. Soy Marketing with the U.S. Soybean Export Council, is joining us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Thanks, Greg. And this is Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
Agriculture Today continues with our weekly horticulture segment. Mike Side is a nursery crops and horticultural marketing specialist, Cheryl Boyer. Cheryl's also an active participant in the Center for Rural Enterprise Engagement here at K-State. One of the things you and your team took up, Cheryl, recently was looking into the marketing of horticultural produce and products online and some of the trends there. Now, what was that all about?
Well, one of the things we've really been interested in the last few years is the idea of e-commerce. And since one of our goals is to help small rural agriculture businesses stay in their rural communities, that people that operate them stay in their communities and have viable, active businesses, we think selling online is a great way to do that. But with horticulture, it's a unique challenge. Now, there have been mail order companies for years and years.
Eons.
Right. But one of the trends that we've begun to see in today's online marketplace is that people want to go to a generic place like Amazon and buy everything, including plants. And that landscape has been changing rapidly over the last few years. And so we kind of sought to learn what we could about it because we were seeing really fascinating things like unboxing videos of horticultural products, which is something you generally see in the technology industry with a device, not necessarily with a plant. And what we're seeing are finished plants. And when we say finished, we mean a quart or a gallon or a 3-gallon size tree or shrub, completely finished like you would buy in a garden center. Whereas mail order tends to be smaller, sometimes dormant plants. And it's just kind of a different expectation for how plants will grow. So consumer expectations are changing. They want to go to Amazon and get a quart size annual delivered to their house in 2 days with no mess in the box, perfect plant, no damage. And we're just kind of fascinated by this idea. And how do we help stakeholders in Kansas get a leg up on this business? What are the opportunities? So we've explored that.
How did you pursue that? Well, this broad range of details that might go into this kind of marketing.
Right. So it's really kind of fun for me as a horticulturist to learn about all these different variables that are evaluated from almost an agricultural communications perspective. And we took an ag economist look at it as well. So it started out as an undergraduate student research project, and we got access to the membership list for a national horticultural association, and we started looking at their sites to see if they were selling on Amazon, for one, and if not, if they had their own fully functioning shopping cart on their own website. And we found that of 498 businesses, members of this national organization, 4 were selling on Amazon. Now, this isn't comprehensive. It's sort of a benchmark, first look kind of situation, but we think it's nicely representative. And then we found just a handful more that sold on their own shopping carts. Most of them were very difficult to use. They weren't very user-friendly, and that's an indicator of, our skills are in growing plants, not necessarily navigating how to sell online. And so at least one of the websites had language that said, download our form, fill it out, scan it in, email it to us, and if nobody has contacted you in 7 days, contact us again. And, at that point, just with the language, you've lost that customer.
Not customer friendly at all then.
Right. So we're really excited. It was published this fall in the Journal of Hort Technology, which is an American Society for Horticulture Science journal. And they wrote a press release about it that was released just before Thanksgiving, and it was picked up all over the industry, and I had calls internationally from people who were interested in what we were learning. So we're already planning a new project with undergraduate students this coming spring where we're going to look at characterizing the Amazon plant store. What does it look like? And, I'm not saying that selling on Amazon is for everyone. They have some pretty tight restrictions. And I think our shipping infrastructure is going to have to change in the horticulture world. So it's really a fascinating and exciting topic to follow.
It's an opportunity, you think, and a strong opportunity for everybody out there in this area.
We think so. I mean, as land values near urban centers get more and more expensive, we think people are going to want to continue to live in their smaller communities, and they need to have a viable business. And our shipping options are getting better and better, and so it's exciting to see the industry stay on top of these things. In addition to meeting their stakeholders online and figuring out what they'll respond to. So we're getting there.
It may be a whole new era in horticultural marketing. Looking forward to see what else you come up with as you explore this further and provide recommendations to interested parties out there. And there's another thing somewhat associated with this that you've been looking at the center as well, and that is basically what gets people's attention with online marketing. Is that correct?
That's correct. So we've had 2 federal state marketing improvement program grants. And the first one, we really looked at what our stakeholder businesses were thinking about social media and new media marketing. So we interviewed them all over the state, and that work has been published now. But the probably key finding we got from that was from customers who had confusion compared to when they were looking for a sale on Facebook and owners saying, well, no, customers don't want me to sell to them. So there's a disconnect there. So we thought there needs to be a nice mix of education, other items, events, and selling on your new media marketing tools like social media, as well as your traditional marketing tools like the newspaper and radio. So we thought our next question was, what will consumers respond to? So on our second project, we're currently looking at the data right now. We have a regionally representative sample of consumers, and we made a series of Facebook posts with fake garden centers, and we were testing variables like whether or not there are people in the photo, if there is a special sale on the plants, or if it's educational. So what the message is, whether there are people present, and we were looking at a variety of horticultural crops. So we're looking at that data now, and it's really exciting. So our students are writing their theses this semester, and we'll have some exciting results to share in the future. But just looking at the preliminary heat map results of what people clicked on that was interesting to them is fascinating.
And this field is ever evolving, so
that's true.
It's a task that may continue, and as far as tracking the new ways of marketing via online mechanisms, social media and otherwise. Well, Cheryl, keep us posted on all of this as it continues to bear fruit with good information. Thank you for coming over.
You're welcome.
Cheryl Boyer is with the Center for Rural Enterprise Engagement here at Kansas State University, also a nursery crops and horticultural marketing specialist with K-State Research and Extension. Cheryl, good enough to be along with us for this week's K-State Horticulture segment. And with that, our time's away for today. Thanks for tuning in. Please be back with us right here tomorrow, won't you? Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.